Good evening, everyone, and welcome to our latest Free Press Book Club meeting for Manitoba, the stories behind the food we eat by Kimberley Moore and Janis Thiessen. Thank you all so much for joining us. We'll kick things off with a quick round of introductions. My name is Nadya Pankiw, and I am your book club administrator. We have Free Press Arts and Life reporter Eva Wasney joining us as host, Chris Hall from McNally Robinson, and authors Kimberley Moore and Janis Thiessen. This stream is coming to you live from Winnipeg, which is Treaty 1 land and the original territories of the Anishinaabe, Cree, Ojibwe, Dakota, Lakota, Dene peoples, and the homeland of the Red River Métis. In a moment here, I'll pass it off to Chris for an introduction, and then Kimberley and Janis will take it away with the recipe, followed by a Q&A. If you have any questions, there is a live chat box to the bottom right of the video, and we will get to those questions when we can. After today's discussion, I will introduce our next pick. And with that, over to you, Chris.
Thank you, Nadia. So I wasn't sure what to expect from Manitoba when I first looked into reading it. I too have been asked in my travels over the years, what is Canadian food? Or what is a Canadian food? And so I've known for a long time that how impossible it is to answer that. So I wasn't surprised to find that the book offers such a mix of stories and origins and ethnicities that play a part in the food Manitobans eat. Many things I knew, kind of, but many things I didn't. I was relieved to finally learn why hamburgers at Salisbury House are called nips. I was unaware of controversies and behind pierogi dealing, and I didn't even know there was such a thing as a barbecue scholar. What became clear is that Manitoba food is a mix and a product of the people who eat here. Many people in the book extend food from a simple biological requirement and link it to our more spiritual and cultural sense of ourselves. But what that really means is different for each of us. And as we learn more about each other, maybe we can appreciate what a mixed lot we are. And maybe we can do so over lunch. So I've introduced a number of these book club sessions, but never before have I thrown it over to an author who's going to mix a cocktail. But that's exactly what I'm going to do now. So over to you, Kimberley Moore and Janis Thiessen.
Thank you. How do you want to do this, Janis? Do you want to tell people about what we're going to make and let me know how to make it, or
For sure. Yeah.
what's the division of labor?
That sounds perfect. We're on page 30 in the book, the Geisha Girl Cocktail Revised. And so we will start with, what is this? 3/4 ounce of dry gin, but you're going to double that because there's two of us, unless you want to split the cocktail, which is also possible.
The shot glass is not big enough to quadruple it, so maybe we'll
stick with one each. Plus, it'll end up being a very weird hour otherwise. Yeah. So there's two Geisha Girl cocktail recipes in the book, one labeled original, one labeled revised. The original one is the one that the University of Nevada, Las Vegas Archives has as part of the collection from Nat Hart, who was, if you've read the book, one of the fellows who founded Ichiban. And so that's kind of the first version that they had when they were preparing a menu. But the revised one is the one that they first offered in the actual restaurant. And so you can see they're incredibly different, but they're so called because they would have come in a ceramic glass like this. And in fact, Ichiban still has ceramic glasses. The first time I was there, I found it so hilarious that I got the Panda Bear one. They have a big opening in the back for pouring in the drink, and then a little hole just above his hands where you would insert the straw. You pay a little extra, you get the glass to take home with you. But the Geisha Girl container seemed a little problematic, so I did not get that one. I got the Panda Bear. So yeah, 3/4 ounces of dry gin. We're using patent 5 gin because it's made here in Winnipeg.
Wrong side.
To that, we will add 1 ounce of sake. And I just went to the liquor mart and I bought the stuff that Ujiro sells. So that's the stuff you can get there. throw an ounce of that in, or in our case, since we're making two at once?
Yeah.
Yeah, 2 ounces then for if you're doubling it. To that, we will then add 3/4 ounces of cherry brandy. I tried to find a small bottle. They only sell one bottle at the liquor mart, and it's like giganticus size. So apologies to all of you who have like 3/4 ounce cherry brandy for the remainder of your life. You can make this cocktail every day till you die, I guess, and use up that cherry brandy. 3/4 ounces.
What did we decide in terms of method? Are we gonna throw it all in the shaker? Are we gonna layer it in the glass?
You have strong views about grenadine, so I will let you share them.
I think it should be poured on top. Especially given the context of when this cocktail was invented. It was the 70s, you know, sequence disco, and it's a feature drink at a restaurant where your food is lit on fire. So I think, you know, maybe it should have something visually going on, but I don't know that for sure. Because the other alternative is that a drink for women should be pink, right? So do you want to try to layer it? And if
Sure.
it looks bad,
You don't
we'll
wanna shake it.
stir it.
Sounds good, yeah. So 3/4 ounce times 2 is 6/4, I can't do math. 1.5 ounces, am I right? You just threw a pile of brandy in, right?
No, I just poured the lime juice. I
Oh.
poured all the clear ingredients
Oh, I
in
see, I see.
together.
So the juice of half a lime, or in our case, a full lime squeezed, or you can go, oh my gosh, she's got the fancy equipment. I'm just like with my fist just going, I'm sorry, I don't have the accoutrements. I usually just buy the real lemon, little plastic bottle. It's like real lime. You can get that to you. Anyway, so all the clear.
So I think there's alcohol densities
That's
too, right? Sweet things are heavier, drier things are lighter, and grenadine is the heaviest. So now I'm gonna shake up all of the clear ones. Everybody's ready? This is gonna be loud. Let's all do it together. Go. I don't have a method.
Nicely done.
And then do we just take this off?
Yes, I literally used this only once and it was an accident, so I'm glad that I'm not handling the equipment. I'm unskilled.
Okay,
Should I hold it up so for the sake of the camera? Woo, look at this.
okay, but I just don't really know when half and half is.
That's all right. You'll get the stronger one.
Ooh, can I put it down?
Awesome.
So Janice, I also have a cup from Ichiban. I think I got this like a decade ago and I went for the Lucky Cat option. And like until about 5 minutes before this had a plant in it. So I'm excited to use it for the first time in a while. But I'm just thinking about the bartenders at Ichiban and how complicated of a glass this must be, like a vessel to make a drink or pour a drink into, because I'm like trying to get it in the back. And
I was just thinking of trying to pour mine in there too, but it's like
yeah,
bad.
it's
really bad.
it's complicated. Yeah, cute
Use a
but
funnel.
complicated.
No.
Okay. So Janice, if you can hold this one up
Yep.
without stirring it, you can see how it's layered.
No.
And then I'm gonna try to just pour this over the spoon and a little bit on Janice's hand. And I have no bartending skills, but in theory, it should have been prettier.
It's still lovely.
We'll try again. How about, okay, one more chance.
Maybe not over the computer equipment.
We're no fun.
I have no fun. Indeed. That's awesome. It is
Okay.
very pink.
It didn't work.
Well, cheers.
Alex,
And
cheers.
If yours looks better than mine, send me a picture of it.
Ooh, that's a lot happening there.
Yeah, there's a lot going on there. It's quite sweet. Like that's a lot of grenadine to include in a cocktail. So that's interesting. I don't know if I had this particular flavor in mind when I was thinking about how it would all come together. And so I guess that's like maybe an interesting jumping off point about like recipes and being able to recreate these old recipes from 1973 when the restaurant opened. I'm just curious what you might take from that as like what the tastes of the day were and that kind of thing.
Well, I mean, there's such a difference between the original and the revised. Like there's very little that carries over. It's just literally the lime juice that's the same in both recipes, right? So it's obvious that they are not going to, and to me, it seems to suggest that they're not going for a particular taste. They want it to look a certain way, or they want to make use of, you know, flavors that are popular at that time. I don't know what Kim, you had said that you had seen the geisha girl on the current menu and it's not gin based, right?
Yeah, now it's made with rum. So Janis, when you did the research in the archives, there was a little notebook page and it had all sorts of versions of recipes for cocktails on it. And so that is the difference between the original and the revised versions. The revised version is the one that actually made the menu, but it seems like there was just experimentation going on, and that it seems pretty logical that just like today, the drinks on the menu would have changed over time and kept the same names, just, you know, the ingredients changed to reflect what's popular because you want to sell more drinks.
And the price as well, because this was served for $1.60 when the restaurant opened.
Yeah. And there's probably maybe less grenadine in it.
Yeah, maybe a like slightly less sweet palate for diners today. And also just like talking about the recipe, because as you were discussing, Kim, we don't actually have the directions for how this is like mixed up and served up. And is that something that either of you like, is that something that you find is common when looking back at old recipes, that maybe there's bits and pieces missing that have been lost to history?
Yeah, I think that's true of history as a whole, right? There are the facts of the matter, and then there's the interpretation of it. And so with anything, there's a little bit of guesswork that goes on. And like I tried to do an educated guess about how to combine these ingredients, and it didn't go as planned. So I think that's kind of a good reflection of what, especially the process of food history is like, because there's so many fragments of this past, like not a lot of restaurant menus, not a lot of embodied knowledge from kitchens. This sort of common culture is not preserved in archives apart from very tiny pieces of it. So you know, maybe with recipes as well, there's maybe more interpretation that has to go into it, or more hunting, or more thought about how do these pieces fit together.
Interesting. And that's like that is very clear throughout the book that you're looking in all of these different places. And as somebody who spent a lot of time in the newspaper archives myself, I know how difficult it can be to find the information you're looking for. So I'm curious if you could just kind of talk about your process for finding information when there isn't a big database of like restaurant history and home cooking history.
Well, that's one of the reasons why we did oral history interviews, right? So for this project, in addition to the book, in addition to what's all on the website, and each chapter has a QR code that links you to the relevant, you know, website content. There's a whole archive of oral history interviews that we conducted that are now at the Oral History Center, where Kim is at the University of Winnipeg. And they're there, not just the digital audio files, but transcripts and timed indexes and, you know, 500-word summaries, so that folks can do their own thing with their own research with that source material. But yeah, in the absence of physical print sources, you need to talk to the people. certainly we did look at, of course, you see this in the book, all sorts of other print sources, but there's a dearth of them for certain subjects that for historians, we haven't, because of who the historians have been historically, we haven't seen certain topics as important or relevant or historical. And so that doesn't get studied, those materials don't get kept. And thankfully, as the makeup of historians changes over time and starts to look a little more diverse, so too do the subjects that we study. And oral history is a big part of why that has changed.
And I have so many questions jumping off of that, but if you could expand a little bit on why food history is one of those understudied topics.
Oh, sure. Not the stereotype is that food is and food preparation is a woman's task, right? Particularly domestically. It's not always the case. Certainly not always the case historically, but that's how it's thought of generally. That's a stereotype, right? And so that's been seen as not relevant, not important. It's not politics. It's not, great man. It's not the economy. It's all those things actually. But over time, the last 20-ish years, I think we've started to realize that food history is actually central, not just understanding how we feed ourselves and our control over the food system and our control of our own health, but also food is a way to study every other aspect of human history.
And I want to kind of drill into the oral history side of this project. And this prior to the pandemic, this project had a food truck component, which is just a fascinating way to conduct this kind of research, in my opinion. And I'm curious what your experiences were like on the food truck, like getting people to come and talk about their recipes and make their food for you. What did those kind of experiences and being able to talk to people as they were going through the motions of cooking, what do you think that added to the oral history you were able to capture?
I think it put people at ease. The truck was an attention getter, and so there was a certain appeal to be invited to go cook for someone on a food truck. Why I want to cook on a food truck? Who wouldn't want to do that? So in doing that, in bringing people into kind of this neutral space, they don't have to come to my house or my office, or I don't have to kind of intrude upon their personal life. We can meet in this neutral space, and there's a fun aspect to it. It's just fun. So if we can be in the truck together, having fun and going through the motions of making this recipe, it takes the kind of official, for the record, history pressure off of that storytelling. And you can just be there together as an interviewer. You can just ask questions out of genuine curiosity, like, what are you doing? Why are you doing that? What's that for? And people will tell you and continue to tell you the story of that food in the context of their whole life, which, as Janis said, is much, much bigger than just that food.
Yeah, there's often jumping off points. And I really love like the book includes so many different formats to the story. And I really like how you included little snippets of interviews and like pieces because it adds so much color. You feel like you're kind of like in the kitchen with these people. It's like fly on the wall in your conversations, which is pretty neat and I think impactful as well. And so the truck, unfortunately, is no longer, correct?
Correct.
Right. And I'm curious, what like do you have any plans to get back into people's kitchens to like do any more of this style of historical recording?
Yes. We're working on creating a food lab at the University of Winnipeg. Hopefully space and funding are available for that at some point. But it would be then a classroom that's converted into a kitchen where students can cook together, where faculty can cook together, staff can cook together, members of the public, chefs, you can have speaker series, but basically everything that was happening on the food truck would happen in this space, this kitchen on campus instead. So more cooking interviews is the hope, just in a different, less volatile venue.
Yeah, Janis also has university classes in our oral history center classroom, which is just a regular classroom with tables and outlets and convection kind of elements that go on. So where there's a will, there is a way that Janis will find to cook in her history classes.
Nice. You can do a lot with a hot plate, it turns out. That's great. And before we kind of like dive into the nitty-gritty of the book, I'm just curious to hear a little bit more about your individual kind of journeys to food history as an academic subject.
I got here because Janis made me do it. My background is in oral history. So I, teach oral history. I help people kind of achieve their goals in that realm. But the benefit of doing that is that you get to shift gears to many different kinds of stories, right? So I'm always prepared to dive in to stories about anything. And of course, food seemed really fun. Working on this kind of project is fun. Like at the end of the project, I realized it was this journey of asking for ridiculous things and people saying yes to us, from the grant and the food truck to this book containing maps and recipes and QR codes and academic book chapters. So we just kept asking for what we felt we wanted and getting it. So that was fun. That's how I got here. I signed up with Janis. We kept asking for things, and then I became somewhat a food historian.
I have to put in a plug for Kim's workshops at the Oral History Center, which are open to everybody, not just students and faculty. I have done oral history since 1995, but I came to the U of W in 2009 and took her workshops shortly after that. And if I'd taken them 20 years earlier, it would have been an easier path. So there's some things you learn by doing and some things you learn by studying, and sometimes it's great to combine the two and realize that, oh, the way I've been doing works, but there is also an easier and a better way. But as for food history, I came to it by accident myself. I had a book called Snacks, Canadian Food History from University of Manitoba Press. And as I was researching that, I was thinking I was doing business and labor history, which I was. But Ian Mosby contacted me through Twitter and was like, it's food history, right? Do you know this food historian? And I'm like, food history? That can't be real. But it turned out I was doing it and just enjoyed it so much and found it so useful for, as I say, accessing all kinds of different histories and making them accessible then in turn to a readership that once Snacks was finished, wanted to keep doing food history. And shout out to U of M Press, who were so wonderful with Snacks and were so amazing with, as Kim says, letting us do all these goofy things and accepting that we wanted like really lovely full color photographs, like it was a coffee table book, but also a cookbook, but also a bunch of maps, but also some academic chapters, but also QR codes. It didn't matter what we threw at them, they were all enthused. And it also helped very much too that with the food truck, Diversity Food Services, who are also Spruce Catering, both wonderful groups, partnered with us and made that happen, because it's one thing to write a grant application and say, it would be awesome, food truck, and then you get it and you go, oh, what now? So grateful to them, grateful to the research office at U of W, grateful to Kevin Smith, Workplace Health and Safety, who made all of that possible when it was just a weirdo idea that Kim assured me was never going to happen because no one would be crazy enough to let that happen.
I said no.
And here we are.
shout out to our colleague Kent Davies. Like this
Yes.
was, the book has our names on it, but the food history project was so big. It was prolonged too because of the pandemic. So, a 4-year project turned into 6. And there were so many essential people with really different skill sets that were necessary in making this work. Our colleague Kent does all the equipment and audio recording on a food truck with a generator while there are cooking sounds and whatnot. Diversity, everything from saving us from frozen trucks and stolen generators to teaching us to not chop our fingers off. We had to learn it all, yeah.
And so many amazing students too, many of whom are cited in the book. So
Janis learned what a podcast was and how to make story maps.
Love it. Lots of, yeah. And you both had to get your food handlers, I understand, in order to run the truck properly.
Janis got the food handlers and I
Okay.
drove the truck. So
Yeah. So lots of new skills and new experimentation through this project. And I
don't
mean,
forget
like,
new limits.
yeah, yeah. And I mean, so like there's all of these different people involved in putting this project together, but within each individual chapter, there's also so much going on and so many different threads that you've pulled together into these really lovely kind of vignettes of places and people and policies, like government policies as well. And it all kind of like melds in together. So I'm curious to hear how you selected what you wanted to include in each chapter and like what the synthesization process was like when you had this mass of interviews and archival research and all this stuff and how you kind of synthesized it into these chapters.
We had started from the beginning that we were not going to do the standard academic process of you do all the research and at the end of your grant period, you publish a thing. We were publishing as we went. So we had, as Kim said, our GIS story maps and we had podcast episodes. And so some things had already been covered.
Yeah, I guess what people don't realize about oral history is it's all the regular work of history, like digging through the archives and reading what everybody else has written about this subject and looking for the holes in that. But in doing oral history, you get to have that context, and then people who either self-select and volunteer to be interviewed, or Janis's students who had very specific people in mind that they wanted to interview, those people who share their lives with you, they tell you what's important. So, we have an idea of what's missing, we have an idea of what we like, but then at the end of the day, people will tell you these stories and you find new rabbit holes. And there are a lot of dead ends, and there are a lot of things you just have to leave on the shelf. So at the end of the day, I think there are kind of 8 sections of the book that we thought were good stories that we really loved, that were complete enough to put in the book, which doesn't necessarily mean complete.
Yeah, and that's interesting. And I noticed in the Fat Boys chapter, obviously that's one of those stories that's mostly complete, but there's still questions about where exactly Greek chili came from and what the origin story of that particular food item, right? And so were there any you mentioned holes, like gaps in the record. Were there any particularly satisfying gaps that you were able to fill in through either your research or through interviews with people?
Yeah, the original food bar, being part of the Fat Boy story and bringing together the major kind of folks associated with the origins of the Fat Boy. We put them all in the same restaurant in the original food bar. And I love that. That was an amazing kind of moment for me.
And so the interview was conducted in the former spot that this restaurant was in.
No, there's an interview with John Janakis, who we all know from Simon G's, and Dimitri Skouras, who's of the Red Top Skouras family, and of John Caligaris. I'm going to say it's Caligaris from VJ's fame. So we have their interviews, and in going through a lot of kind of press articles about it, and in going through the business registration files in the archive, we were able to figure out that they all worked in Andrew Petrakis's original food bar on Main Street, which was just across from the McLaren Hotel. So they have this common origin story, and I think it's kind of reasonable to pin the origins of the practice in that neighborhood there. So.
Right. And that was like a little tidbit that kind of came, correct me if I'm wrong, came out of just an offhanded comment during an interview.
Yeah, just an aside.
And so that right there, is that does that kind of explain the power of oral history and helping filling in some of those gaps?
Yeah, I think so. Because it's only in all of those things working together that you get there. And I think it's a really good example, like the fat boy in Greek chili, because so many people have told this story. It pops up in the newspaper in one form or another, or on a little kind of video vignette. It reemerges kind of on a 5-year cycle, but nobody's sort of done the front to back of it, right? It keeps changing a little every time. So it's a good example of all of those things working together.
Mm-hmm. And are any of the stories that you chose to include in the book, are any of them particularly meaningful to each of you for one reason or another?
I really liked the Itchy Band story. I had never been there until starting this research, and just found it hilarious. It's just, I had not been to teppanyaki restaurants, so I didn't know what to expect, and I just found it so bizarre and a little kitschy. And then once it made us want to look into the history of this place a bit, and then to find that this is not owned and founded by Japanese people. You think, oh, okay, well, now I know what the story is going to be, right? It's about people pretending to be an ethnicity they're not, or taking over an ethnicity that they're not, and then selling it to others, right? But as you find out reading the chapter, right, these are people who did have expertise, some of them, particularly the ones responsible for the food in Japanese cuisine, at a time when there aren't cookbooks and there isn't that kind of extensive travel. And then it bleeds throughout Winnipeg in terms of the training of one of the fathers of sushi in Winnipeg happens at Ichiban, and just kind of flows forward from there. And then it just ties in so nicely too with some of the debates that had been happening at the time of writing and a little before within the food history group of scholars about questions of authenticity, and should we even be asking questions of authenticity, because what even does it mean? And so it just became this really fascinating story, I think, that tied together so many threads that I don't think we would have thought were connected when we first set foot in this place. And
I think so too. I think it's appropriate too to do a little shout out to other local historians too, that without threads that tied us to their work, again, the full picture doesn't come into it. Like Lakeview Square, where Ichiban is, it's this whole city block of kind of this brutalist housing, hotel, restaurant complex. There's a Japanese garden, the whole Holiday Towers, the insides were originally like Japanese design inspired. And so it was this really like massive project that we could learn about through Winnipeg Architecture Foundation.
Christian Cassidy.
Similarly, a lot of the West End, like little kind of blip on the radar buildings or locations, we could look to the West End Dumplings blog to fill in those little pieces. So definitely a lot of other people's work helped us do this as well.
Mm-hmm. Big time. And Janis, that question of authenticity, I'm curious where that debate has gone these days. Where does authenticity land on something that is important or isn't important to consider?
it's not a question that scholars value anymore, because there is no original starting point. It assumes that you want to freeze a recipe or a culture at a particular period in time when cultures and recipes are always evolving and are always changing as a result of contact with other cultures, right? So to try and find the authentic one or the real one is a pursuit more of, I would say, a subset of foodies who have a misunderstanding of the role that they have within food culture. It's like, you're not out there to try and capture an original experience. They're all original experiences. And there is no one right one, right? And so this is something that one of our students who was at the time working for Deer and Almond, and so had some connections to folks in the Winnipeg food scene, and managed to do an interview with one of the Japanese chefs, Edward Lamb. And that was the entire topic really of the oral history that he did, was like, what is sushi? It depends who makes it and where they make it and what they value, and there's no one right way of doing it.
And that's so interesting, because I think it's a topic that comes up often in modern day food media as well, and people talking about a new restaurant has opened. This is the concept. Is it authentic to the type of cuisine that they're trying to make, and like fusion and all of these things? Like that's a big topic within the food world as well. So it's interesting to hear a historian's perspective on it, and I think that's a valuable one for sure.
Also an ethnicized or racialized component to it, because the question of authenticity tends to arrive only in certain food cultures, not others, right? So be as experimental and avant-garde as you want if you typically have some, white European background. But if it's other cultures operating within a North American context, there tends to be more of a judgment, I think. And so it's also a question of who gets to experiment and who is, permitted to innovate.
That's a very good point. And Kim, is there any, I don't know, chapter, like piece of information that really sticks out in your mind as being a special one in the book?
No, I don't think so. I think I was pretty neutral and excited about all of it. About Winnipeg, I sort of try to maintain this neutral perspective on it and just sort of watch what happens here. And it's so easy. I think the joy of it was just learning so much about this city and the way it changes over time, or, just as much the way it stays the same. So I think that was it, just filling in this really rich history of Manitoba. I would like to, I think, there were scant records in places like Brandon in northern Manitoba. So I think that would be the counterpoint to the statement I just made, is I learned a lot about Winnipeg, but I sort of felt the need to do that in more places in this province.
And talking about like historically, and how some of these food stories and like restaurant trends and like openings and closures, how that kind of speaks to demographic changes throughout history. I'm curious what you think about Winnipeg's current demographic and the shifts you see with the food scene as it is currently, if you're noticing any trends, if that's something that you're paying attention to at all.
Do you have any feelings?
I was surprised. I think some of this came about when we were generating the maps for the book, right? I was a little surprised that there were as many Filipino restaurants in the past as there were. I thought that was a much more recent trend. And I was also, the story of Bungee's was a surprise to me too. I thought that, Indigenous restaurants in Manitoba were, again, something within the last 10, maybe 20 years. And yet there was this one in the 80s, I suppose it was, if I remember correctly, that was short-lived, but such an incredible story of the community itself coming about and wanting to share this, and you know, a little ahead of its time. I think if it was around now, it would be part of a much larger crowd that would be far more accepting of it, but yeah, sadly too soon.
Yeah, and I guess just waves and waves of trends, right? The way that things are the same now is that, you know, there's something that becomes popular. And it becomes popular for a social reason, a social need, right? The rise of lunch because people went downtown to work. And now, you know, restaurants are changing the way they do business post-pandemic because there's not that many people at work. The government is making people go back to work in the office so restaurants can have a lunch crowd again. So these trends in restaurant styles, not only, you know, the food we eat, but the places we eat in, you know, it's different trends, but more of the same patterns.
Yeah, and waves of immigration too, right? So different ethnic groups, different nationalities arriving, and so you have different restaurants. And I think, you know, the Greek burger joints, right? So many of them are opening up, as discussed in the book, because they can't find, you know, employment elsewhere. They're relying on Greek networks because they can't get bank loans, right? So Greek Canadian networks are making that possible for them, and they're sharing recipes, but it's not outright Greek food. It's you know, a kind of a blend of Canadian, whatever that is, food and Greek Canadian food. But I think now, you know, you can open up a Nigerian restaurant and you don't have to like dumb it down or anything, right?
Yeah.
While you were talking, I realized I did have I do have feelings about chapters in this book. One of them was actually, I am not Greek. I have no connection to the Greek community. I have one Greek friend. But the outsized contribution that the Greek Winnipeggers have made to the restaurants here, to the food we eat for decades and decades and decades, like 4 generations deep, blew me away. I got really emotional about it. And it was through this really, you know, helpful mutual support. You're not a threat to me. Go make your business a success attitude. And secondly, I am a proud West Ender, and the man who invented the pizza pop lived on my street.
That's a wonderful claim to fame. And that's something that's like kind of happened for me personally, is just thinking about these restaurants that I've visited, that I've eaten at, and just like being able to now have this whole backstory that I never knew about. It just like makes me think about the places that I've been going all my life. Like the Red Top is one of those places. And it makes me think about it in a little bit of a different lens, and I love that. Um, and so you mentioned Canadian food, and I know that that is a big kind of point in this book, is that Manitoba food doesn't exist. And so I'm curious what you hope this book and these collections of stories um, do to challenge or expand the idea of what Manitoba food might be.
I guess just to put the question aside, right? To kind of look past the food and to the context of the food, like whether it's going to restaurants, whether it's trends in dining, it's always, the food is always saying more. It's telling a bigger story than what's on your plate. If you're a regular at a restaurant, you're a regular for more reasons than you like what's on the menu. So I guess just an encouragement to think about it as something much bigger, part of a much bigger kind of social picture.
Yeah, getting rid of some of the boundaries and barriers. I think we encountered this even when it came to people contacting us, some of them, about being interviewed. You know, we had folks who sometimes would say, like to be interviewed, I'd like to cook this thing, but I don't know that I count as a Manitoban because they moved here from elsewhere, or because they've only been in the province X number of years, or whatever it is. And it's like, do you see yourself as a Manitoban? Then you're a Manitoban. You know, is it food being, we make this point in the final chapter, right? Is it food being eaten by Canadians? Then it's Canadian food.
Yeah.
And it's not a useful or interesting or productive question anymore. So throw it aside and find better questions.
That's great. And I think this is a good point to jump into some of the reader questions that we received. So on the point of people sharing recipes on the truck, this reader was interested if there were people who wouldn't want to share their secret recipes. If that was anything you encountered.
Well, we had a process. The way we sort of invited people on the truck was that people were self-selected. So you had to fill out a form and get in touch with us and volunteer to share your recipes. So we didn't, except for, you know, big theme, the Greek chili. John Caligari says his dad's is in a safe.
Under lock and key.
Up, but everybody else signed up and shared freely.
And I'm curious if you've thought about that idea of like people who want to keep their recipes, like their personal recipes, secret. If that is something that you've just thought about within a historical context, because we're talking about these records not being available, including like personal and family records that people might want to keep secret for whatever reason, point of pride or whatever it is.
I think we just touched on that a bit, personally ourselves, when it came to sharing our family recipes. You know, a photo of Kim's, what is it, grandmother's?
Yes.
Yeah. And my an index card that my mother had filled out for my twin, who was the cook among the pair of us. Like, she didn't fill one of those out for me because she knew I wasn't ever going to make it, right? So to decide to choose those things, you know, there are other things that like we could have shared that we chose not to. I think everyone, and that's one of the beauties of oral history, is that it's a mutual construction. It's not a complete bearing of one's soul necessarily, and you can interview the same person in a different context on a different day, and they might share different stories or tell the same story differently, or, you know, or if it was a different interviewer, you might get different stories too.
Or, you know, 10 years ago versus 10 years from now. The story will always change with like the time and the teller and the audience and kind of whether it's on a food truck or not. But I think kind of on that, you know, being guarded about recipes, the contrast between that and being forthcoming and giving and sharing with recipes is we encountered more of the latter. The project wouldn't have been possible without it. And even that final cookbook chapter, your mother's recipe, my grandmother's recipes are in there, but there are reams and reams and reams of cookbooks from Bedell homes, from figure skating associations, from the hockey team families. There's so many community cookbooks. So everybody's willing to pitch in something, right? You know, maybe they did miss an ingredient. I have no idea, but on the surface, anyway, it seems that there's a lot that people are willing to share.
Yeah, and I love a community cookbook and have found the same when trying to get people to submit recipes. It seems like more people are excited than not to send and share their recipes for their favorite dishes. The last reader question we have is, what stories brought you the most joy and what stories brought you the most sadness? And I know we kind of touched on that a little bit, so if you have anything you'd like to add.
Joy and sadness, probably both, in terms of the trip to Churchill for me. Just being in the archives there and listening to people through, you know, CBC recordings that were in the archives, and then also our very first day attending a town hall where the same promises of this time this investment is really going to turn the Port of Churchill around, and to hear those same promises decade after decade after decade over like 50, 60 more years, and to realize that maybe this time isn't going to be different, and yet to still see the, I hate the word resilience because I think it's overused and it's also puts the onus on the wrong people. But to see the ways in which folks in Churchill are going about their lives and still willing to share with folks like us who just kind of drop in. Amazing and sad. Yeah.
Yeah, I guess similarly, sort of joy and frustration about the sort of kind of urban-rural divide and the sort of perimeteritis we have in Winnipeg, and it taking so many resources to be able to kind of venture away from the city and really learn about places that are away from here. That was very frustrating. And it's really, it's both. It's not one or the other. It's always a really kind of full of all of the feelings when you learn the nuance of all of the stories and why we tell them. So we have a whole set of narratives about the North End. Many of them are beautiful and great, and many of them are really frustrating and awful. And the West End is very similar in makeup, but they're not really the same number of stories, and it doesn't occupy our collective memory as much. So you start thinking about why we tell the stories we do about particular places, and yeah, I guess it, kindles more of a commitment to reaching a bit further out or digging a little deeper beneath the surface of those.
Yeah, it's a great advice and very applicable to many facets of life for sure.
Well, thank you so much, everyone, for the discussion. Honestly, what a fantastic way to have a cookbook for our book club, and for you guys to be able to be here to elaborate so much. It's very, very interesting. Our September pick has arrived. We will be welcoming author Greg Kearney for an evening with Birdie O'Day. Our meeting will take place right here on our YouTube channel on September 24th. I took a look at McNally's website today and saw that the books are fully stocked in Winnipeg, so you can go pick up your copies. And this will be once again in collaboration with Thin Air. So we'll have some guests from their organization as well joining us for our next meeting. We appreciate everyone who's tuned in with us tonight, and thank you all for reading along. We will see you next time. Okay, we're all done.